why the British Army bet everything on this foreign truck to keep its entire war machine moving. On the last day of May 1940, the beaches at Dunkirk were littered with abandoned lorries. Thousands of them stood half-buried in sand, their engines wrecked by retreating soldiers with sledgehammers and picks, their wheels sunk at odd angles where drivers had simply walked away. Smoke drifted along the shoreline. Overhead, aircraft passed low over the water, and the queues of men waiting to be lifted off the beach stretched back towards the dunes. Britain had just left behind almost the entire motor transport of its field army in France. Records suggest that the British Expeditionary Force lost more than 60,000 vehicles during the campaign, a number so large that it left the army at home with barely enough lorries to move a single armored division, let alone re-equip the force that would now have to defend Britain itself and eventually fight across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and beyond. The question facing the War Office that summer was not abstract. It was mechanical, industrial, and urgent. Where would an army find hundreds of thousands of trucks built to a common standard, rugged enough for desert sand and Russian mud alike, when British factories were already stretched producing aircraft, tanks, and munitions? The answer would not come from a British factory floor at all. It would come from a design already quietly rolling off production lines on the other side of the Atlantic, built by two rival American-owned companies working in a country that had barely begun to arm itself for war. That country was Canada, and the vehicle was the Canadian military pattern truck, a class of lorry that few people outside military history circles remember today, yet which the British Army came to depend upon almost completely. The problem it solved had been building for years. Through the 1930s, the British motor industry produced excellent vehicles, but it produced them in relatively small numbers, tailored to a peacetime army that had never been designed to fight a global war on multiple continents simultaneously. British manufacturers such as Bedford, Morris, and Guy built solid trucks, yet their combined capacity could not remotely match what an army fighting in Europe, Africa, and Asia would soon require. Contemporary accounts indicate that Whitehall had, since the mid-1930s, been in quiet discussion with Ottawa about using Canadian industrial capacity as a reserve source of standardized military vehicles, partly because Canada's automotive sector, dominated by the local subsidiaries of Ford and General Motors, had spare factory space and an established supply chain that British industry simply did not. What existing British production could not solve was scale. A single factory could turn out superb trucks by the hundred. The coming war would demand them by the 100,000, built to a pattern simple enough for inexperienced drivers, robust enough for corrugated desert tracks, and standardized enough that a broken part from one vehicle could repair another hundreds of miles away. The solution had, in fact, already begun to take shape before the war reached its crisis point. Early in 1937, the Canadian Department of National Defence invited both Ford Motor Company of Canada and General Motors of Canada to design a Canadian version of a light infantry truck closely based on the British Morris CS8, recently adopted by the War Office. It was a modest beginning, intended chiefly to equip Canada's own small peacetime army. By 1938, Canadian planners had shifted their ambitions towards something more serious. Heavier four-wheel and six-wheel drive designs, including a medium artillery tractor derived from the British Scammell Pioneer. Prototypes were built and tested through 1938 and into 1939, and by the time the war began that September, blueprints existed for an entire family of vehicles engineered specifically for mass production within Canadian factories, while still meeting exacting British War Office specifications for weight, dimensions, and payload. What followed was an unusual piece of industrial cooperation. Ford Canada and General Motors of Canada, ordinarily fierce commercial rivals, agreed to share tooling knowledge, interchangeable components, and design standards so that trucks from both companies could be repaired using common parts, regardless of manufacturer. The vehicles were first known, rather bureaucratically, as Department of National Defence pattern trucks. But as it became clear they would soon serve far beyond Canada's own forces, they were renamed the Canadian Military Pattern, or CMP. Their most distinctive feature was a short, forward control cab, designed with a stark, flat-paneled shape that gave the trucks their unmistakable pug-nosed profile. This was not an aesthetic choice. The compact cab reduced overall length, which mattered enormously when thousands of trucks needed to be packed into the holds of cargo ships bound for Britain, Egypt, or India. 3 successive cab designs were produced during the war, known simply as the number 11, number 12, and number 13, each a refinement of the last, as production experience revealed weaknesses in the earlier versions. Chevrolet-built CMP trucks typically used a straight-six petrol engine of around 85 horsepower, while heavier 3-ton variants relied on a larger American-built GMC engine. Dodge, through Chrysler's Canadian operations, built its own related range alongside Ford and Chevrolet, and together the 3 companies turned out trucks rated at 8, 15, 30, and 60 hundredweight, covering everything from light utility runabouts to heavy cargo lorries and specialized gun tractors. Production was not without setbacks. Early cab designs proved difficult to seal against dust, a serious flaw for vehicles destined for the western desert, and successive modifications were needed before the trucks were considered fully fit for that environment. By 1940, full-scale production was underway, and Canadian factories were completing tens of thousands of these vehicles annually, shipped across the Atlantic in a nearly continuous stream. Their real test came in the sand and gravel of North Africa. From late 1940 onwards, CMP trucks were issued in vast numbers to British and Commonwealth forces fighting first the Italians and later the German Afrika Korps. Records from a North African campaign describe convoys of CMP trucks stretching for miles across the desert, carrying petrol, ammunition, water, and rations to forward units often separated from their supply bases by hundreds of miles of featureless terrain. The 8th Army's ability to maneuver at all, to advance and retreat across such distances without collapsing from lack of fuel or food, depended overwhelmingly on these Canadian-built lorries. They were not without flaws. Dust ingestion damaged engines. Tires wore quickly on rocky ground, and the truck's relatively high profile made them vulnerable to strafing aircraft. Yet their sheer numbers, mechanical simplicity, and interchangeable parts meant that a damaged vehicle could often be repaired at the roadside, using components salvaged from another, a practical advantage that mattered more in the desert than raw performance figures ever could. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable, true stories like this to the channel. How did the CMP compare with its wartime rivals? Germany's equivalent workhorse, the Opel Blitz, was in many respects a capable design, with a similar payload class and comparable reliability under favorable conditions. But German industry never achieved the scale of standardized mass production that Canada and the United States managed, and fuel shortages increasingly hampered its use as the war progressed. The American-built GMC CCKW, which arrived in large numbers from 1942 onwards, offered 6-wheel drive and greater off-road capability, and in some theaters gradually supplemented or replaced CMP vehicles in Commonwealth service. The two are not true competitors so much as complementary solutions to the same enormous logistical problem, built by allied economies working in step rather than in isolation. Where the CMP truck excelled was not outright technical superiority, but availability married to standardization, a combination that let the British Army field far larger numbers of usable vehicles than either enemy planning or existing British capacity had assumed possible. The wider consequences of this arrangement were significant, though they are easy to overstate. The official British history of the war supply effort later described Canada's wartime truck production as the country's most important material contribution to Allied victory, and the phrase that Canadian vehicles put the British Army on wheels has become a familiar shorthand among historians of the subject. By the war's end, Canadian factories had built roughly 800,000 trucks and light vehicles, a figure that, by some assessments, exceeded the combined military truck output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. This transformed the ratio of vehicles to soldiers within British and Commonwealth forces, giving the Army an unusually high degree of battlefield mobility compared with its opponents. Its influence did not end with the war either. Surplus CMP trucks continued to serve for decades afterwards in conflict from Indochina to the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, and preserved examples survive today in museums and private collections across Britain, Canada, and Australia. Whether this made the CMP truck historically significant in the way of famous tank or aircraft is significant remains, understandably, a matter of some debate among historians. Its importance lay less in dramatic action and more in quiet, continuous logistical endurance. Return for a moment to that beach at Dunkirk, to the wrecked lorries sinking into the sand and the army that had just lost its ability to move. What that scene actually represented was not simply a military defeat, but the exposure of an industrial gap that Britain alone could not close. The answer arrived not through any single dramatic invention, but through years of quiet cooperation between two Canadian factories, a shared design standard, and an ocean of shipping that carried hundreds of thousands of unglamorous, boxy trucks to wherever British and Commonwealth soldiers needed to move. The men who drove those trucks through the western desert could not have known how their vehicles had come to exist, nor how closely their survival depended on decisions made years earlier in Ontario boardrooms. Seen from the distance of history, though, the connection is unmistakable. An army stripped of its transport on a French beach in 1940 was, within 2 years, among the most mobile fighting forces in the world, carried forward not by the industry of the nation it belonged to, but by a truck built abroad to British specifications by companies that had simply been asked to solve a problem no one else could. It was not the glamour of the machine that mattered in the end, but the fact that again and again, it simply kept moving,